Pot roast can be delicious, moist, and tender if it's seasoned well and not rushed in the oven. I'm going to be sharing how to make a delicious pot roast using a chuck roast. Welcome to Lornas.Cookin. I'm Lorna. Before we get started, please hit the subscribe button and the bell, and you'll be alerted the next time I share a recipe, tip, tricks, or even some cool stuff that I'll be sharing. Pot roasts are usually made from the chuck roast, round roast, or brisket. That cut of meat usually comes from the upper part of the cow where it has a lot of muscle, so that cut of meat is very tough. Needs to be cooked quite long for you really to break down that muscle and the connective tissues. I'm going to show you how to make a pot roast using chuck. I would suggest that you look at the video at least once all the way through so you'll be familiar with the steps in doing this recipe. Also, make sure that you put out all of your ingredients and the utensils that you'll need before you start the recipe. Okay. Time to make the pot roast out of a chuck roast. The ingredients for this recipe, I have one chuck roast that's about 5.5 pounds. I have kosher salt, carrots, russet potatoes, celery, Worcestershire sauce, oil, and that could be vegetable oil or canola, corn oil. I have 4 cups of beef broth that I bought. Just make sure you have a good quality beef broth. I have 1 onion, ground black pepper, granulated garlic, thyme, rosemary, all-purpose flour, seasoning salt, and bay leaves. Make sure you rinse all of your vegetables. You don't have to peel like the carrot or the celery, but I do recommend that you just really wash them really well and just cut off the tips and the ends of the celery and the carrots. Cut your vegetables up in pretty much the same size so they'll all cook at the same time. I cut mine pretty big because I don't want them to just break down because it's going to be a long cooking time. So you can always cut up the vegetables to make more servings after the roast and everything is cooked. After you cut up all of your vegetables, just set them aside. Then you're going to prep your chuck roast or whatever type of roast that you'll be cooking by rinsing it and then patting the roast dry. So after I pat the meat until it's dried or the most of the moisture is off, then I start seasoning it. You'll notice that I use a lot of seasoning because this is a big piece of meat. So I first start with the salt, and then I move on to the pepper, and then after that, the other seasonings. But just make sure that you really season this meat well. I mean, it seems like a lot of salt that's being used, but once the vegetables and everything, they're in the pan and they're cooking, you want that to really permeate, really to get into the meat as it's cooking. Another note is that I only season the top and some of the sides of the meat because all of the seasonings are going to go down into the pan as it cooks. And so it's not necessary to season the top and the bottom and the sides of a roast. After I season the meat, I then cover it with flour. I mean, all over the meat, in the crevices of the meat. So once I sear it, there'll be a nice crust on the roast. I want to make sure that the meat is seared all over the sides, the top, and the bottom. Once I've browned the roast on the top, the bottom, on the sides, I'm going to place it in the pan with the vegetables. After I place my roast in the pan with the vegetables, I got my broth and then I poured that in the pan and I mixed that in with the remnants that was left from, browning the beef. Mix that up really well, and then I added my Worcestershire sauce, and you want to add a little more seasoning to the broth, such as maybe a little bit more salt, a little bit more pepper. I would suggest that you taste just a little bit of the mixture to make sure that it tastes really good, because if it's seasoned really well, almost tastes like soup, then it'll be really good on your roast. After I finished pouring all of the broth over the vegetables over the roast, I covered the pan with foil paper and making sure that it's tightly over the pan. Then I stuck it in the oven at 275. After the roast cooked about 3 hours, I checked it. I took a fork and I stuck the fork in the roast to see how tender it was. Then I basically stuck it back in because it needed a little bit more time. So this size roast needs about 3.5 to 4 hours for it to be fork tender. This roast turned out great. It's tender, it's juicy, falling apart. This is how a pot roast is supposed to be. If you have any pot roast left over, it makes great sandwiches, filling for tacos. It even goes great over baked potatoes. So I hope you enjoyed this recipe. And if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. Take care.